Check. All right. This is weird. That's fine because this is private and I can just delete it. Fucking get out the fucking back. All right. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at a debate between Destiny and Milo Yiannopoulos. Destiny is a Twitch streamer, a political pundit. I would go as far to say he is a type of public political philosopher. Yep, and Milo is once was a very long time ago the golden child of the alternative right, but since 2016 has effectively fallen off the face of the earth. Already what half I was already watched this half paying attention. It is, for lack of a better term, an absolute slaughter with regards to the outcome of this. I don't think is any big surprise. Milo Yiannopoulos never really had any sort of argument or any sort of intellectual rigor when it came to his kind of political views that he used to put out there. Destiny arguably does have a fair bit of that, although it is quite. I'd imagine he wouldn't agree, but it's not as quite as refined or developed as perhaps he thinks that it is. But it is developed enough to effectively trounce just about everyone he talks to, which probably says more about them than it does about him. But I found this conversation particularly interesting because the kind of position Destiny puts forward, I don't think is as strong as he thinks that it is. And that we should be concerned with if someone a bit more rigorous, intellectually rigorous, than someone like a Milo came along and challenged Destiny's kinds of arguments for why we should continue to have some sort of liberal democracy. These arguments might fall by the wayside. So, just to be upfront, I completely agree with Destiny. I don't know about the general kind of goal, or well, not the goal, general kind of conclusion he draws. I don't think the way in which he does it is particularly compelling. So it's more about the working out, I think, than the actual answer that we would arrive to. Anyway, we're going to start this, see how it goes. Yeah. So yeah, let's see how this goes.
Dominant governing ideology of America. We will have 10 minutes each of prepared opening statements, and then each of you guys will be able to go through 5 minutes of rebuttals each, and then I will ask 2 questions for each of you, and we'll rotate between you guys. You'll each have 5 minutes to answer the question I've directed towards you, and the other person will have 3 minutes to respond. And then we will have a 30-minute Q&A and crossfire where you guys will have questions from the audience, and you will also then be allowed to sort of go back and forth between the two of you. So you can kind of have fun with it. It'll be a complete free-for-all. So after that...
Typically, we will not be watching the Q&A. As someone who has taken many Q&As, been to many public lectures and heard the Q&As are always... and no disrespect for the people who actually ask questions in this particular Q&A, but I find them dreadfully painful and generally don't add anything particularly interesting to the conversation. They're mainly to bring the audience in, to get people really in, but yeah, look, I think when it's like a conference, that's a totally different ballgame, obviously. When it comes to like a public thing, it can be quite traumatic.
That will go for 5 minutes each for closings, and you guys are allowed to have prepared openings, and I will give you guys hand signals throughout so that we're all on time and so that everything is running smoothly. So let's get started with the openings. It will be 10 minutes each, and we are going to start with Milo.
Is that indigo?
My hair?
Yes.
We call it blue over here.
Okay. I have to give you some credit for having the cojones to show up in Tennessee barely a month after the bullet-ridden bodies of children have been buried, as a sort of representative for a culture that did it, and offering anything but condolences and sympathy. I think it's disgusting. I think it's shameful. How dare you? How dare you show up here offering anything but sympathy? Because, you know, I think, I should stand or something. We're familiar with what happened in Tennessee. We're less familiar with the reasons why. But the reason was that at any given time in society, there are about 20% of people who are just nuts. And those people will glom on to whatever the fad is for people who are nuts. So the current nuts is trans. You can see in the social trends when you plot anorexia and bulimia, which was the big thing when I was growing up, against the new nuts. That there's basically about 1 in 5 people who are just not really all there and will kind of do whatever. But when you hand those people, those unstable and dangerous people, a victimhood script, when you give them a license to commit violence in the name of their supposed identities, instead of giving them the treatment and the love and the prayers that they need, you turn those people into killers. You turn those people into time bombs. And there used to be something in America that would protect against that. It was Christianity. I think it's shameful that anybody would show up so soon after a tragedy caused by the kind of ideologies that you support and do anything but offer sympathy and condolences and celebrate the ideology that has protected us against this sort of thing for so long. It's outside the scope of our evening this evening to prove or disprove the truth of Christianity or Christ or whatever. But I'll make a few points. There is no America without Christ. And the reason for that is that this is an intrinsically and fundamentally Christian nationalist country, by which we mean it's built into the architecture of the nation. There's no getting away from it. You can lie about it. You can pridefully claim that, you know, you can be good people without Christ. You can't. You're just inheriting a system of good and evil from the culture in which you grew up, which accords with the natural law. America was founded, as Adams told us, with a constitution that is wholly unsuited to the governance of anyone but a moral and religious people. And when he said religious, he meant Christian, although he himself was wandered through various different kinds of heresy. What Adams said was that this country is, that its founding documents, that its founding architecture, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were wholly and fundamentally unsuited to the governance of anything but a moral and religious people. Do you think that America is comprised of a moral and religious people today? Obviously it is not. And what he meant specifically was Christianity, because the way that America is set up outsources morality to Christianity. And without it, it doesn't work, because jury trials don't work when people vote with race instead of conscience and truth. A society doesn't work when people don't obey contracts, don't obey their word, when they're oath breakers. The architecture of America rests fundamentally on a bedrock of Christianity, without which the entire thing falls apart. And that's exactly what's happening. And you don't have to take my word for it. You don't even have to take Adams's word for it, but one of your own Supreme Court justices, somebody who was famously left-wing, Rehnquist, I think it was. Can't bother to look it up, but he said that everything in America presupposes the legal system, the social system, the government. Everything in America presupposes the existence of the Judeo-Christian God. Without that, it all comes tumbling down. And without that, it is coming tumbling down. And without that, we're not able to give people who have terrible sicknesses and weaknesses and defects the help that they need. Instead, we hand them victimhood scripts, and they shoot up schools, they shoot up churches, whether they are young white guys on antidepressants or whether they're transgender people who are told that it's white Christians are responsible for all of their miseries. It is Christianity that keeps us nice to each other, that keeps us being good to one another. And if you toss it out, as happened in 1776 here, you have a really big problem on your hands because, and I'm going to say something very radical and difficult to say in Tennessee of all places, there are freedoms afforded to Americans that are too radical and too great and too daring without the insulation of Christianity. The First and Second Amendments don't work unless everyone's Christian. They don't work, and they're not working. They're not functioning. You can't give crazy atheists guns. You can't let shameless liars say whatever they want about other people in public without consequence. There's a sort of unwritten rule that sits behind everything in America. And it is that these are all the things you get to do because we know that you can handle it. We know that you can be trusted with this because you love God, because you respect life, because you won't take other people's lives, because you'll keep your word. Without that, the First and Second Amendments become a sort of license to abuse one another or to kill one another. They become a license to lie. They become a license to murder. They become too much freedom, because there is such a thing. And without an underpinning moral architecture, this country doesn't work. And it's not working. And since this country has fallen away from God, the Christian God, this country has begun to fall apart. And that's why all of this terrible shit is happening. That's why all the awful stuff on TV is going on. It's why you can no longer trust people to keep their words if you don't know them. It's why everybody keeps voting with their skin color or their sexuality or gender or whatever bollocks it is today. Because they're not unified under Christ, because they're not one under Christ, because they're not brothers and sisters in Christ. It doesn't matter if you agree with the literal truth of Christianity or not. The founders did, and they made a country for people who did. And if you don't agree with that, or you don't like God, or you don't see why too much freedom is leading us all to hate and kill each other, and you don't appreciate that we should not only restore Christianity in culture, but require it in public life, you should go to Canada. You should go somewhere else where there's a moral architecture built into the law. But here, it doesn't work without God. And when you don't have him, when instead people replace prayer and the rituals of the church with antidepressants, with compound interest, with games and drink and drugs and fornication, kind of thing he does with his wife, you know, offering her around town like she's common property. America doesn't work when we behave that way, because we'll all just end up murdering each other. That's all.
Destiny, you have
Alright, besides the fact he's clearly intoxicated, Milo's view is that in order to have a functioning society, I presume he means by not working, he means some sort of functioning society. He never defines what it means for a society to be working. Presumably, he means that they're not at least killing each other. That's fair enough. So you would hope that people would need some sort of shared moral values. His idea, if I understand it, if I understand it at all, is that how do I put this? Presumably, he thinks that the only morality that can be shared amongst persons to ensure that they are act in such a way in which this is very wordy. Let me try again. There's obviously many types of morality. There's many different types of codes of how to conduct oneself or how we should treat each other or what we owe to each other. Presumably his argument is that the only one that can work is the Christian one, such that any other society that had anything else but that would not work. That seems obviously false. Again, I guess it hinges or turns upon how you understand what working is. But there have been many societies all over the planet that existed before and after Christ that were not Christian, and they seem to function. Again, it's not entirely clear what he means by work, but they seem to work, right? They seem to work to some sort of extent. You might not agree that it's a very good way for them to work, but that's a separate question. The other problem is from there he leaps from. My understanding is that the position here that's being argued is that America should be a Christian nation, which means effectively that the state should mandate a kind of religion over the people, and that the laws should be informed by the religious kind of people who work in the church, effectively. So that doesn't. So the problem with the view, if you want to be really friendly to it, if you want to be really charitable, is that it simply doesn't follow. Even if you agreed that the only kind of working society had to be a Christian one, if you agreed with that, which it seems highly dubious that that's the case, it doesn't follow from that 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 means that the state should mandate Christianity as a religion. As he kind of points out, whether people realize it or not, and whether this is true, it doesn't matter. We can suppose that the morality of America, what's its laws effectively, is baked or is kind of takes from or emerges from a kind of Christian morality, or the natural law thing aside, and that we've forgotten, or Americans have forgotten that. So the problem with that is that you don't. It seems then if you can have that sort of morality without the state mandating a type of religion over persons, over the society and the individuals in that society, you don't need them to do that. You just need people to accept like these things without understanding where they come from. What really matters is that they agree to these things. So what he needs to do is he needs to bridge a gap between. Well, he needs to argue that the only working society is a Christian one, or the best working society is specifically a society based on Christian morality, and what that is debatable to begin with. Then he needs to get from there to explain why it's necessary that in order to have this sort of morality, that the state must impose on people, to coerce people into accepting a sort of Christianity, right? That's what he needs to do, and he doesn't do that. He just asserts, he just effectively asserts that the nation isn't working, doesn't define what that even means. He immediately leaps to this morality is necessary, and therefore the state must mandate the religion onto persons, that it must coerce them into accepting this. That doesn't follow, because you could have one without the other. What's an example? An analogous example is something like technology. I don't understand how technology works. Presumably you don't either. I mean, I don't really understand it, right? I understand there's wires, I understand there's cables, I understand there's electricity. When it comes to the fundamental kind of like way in which these things work, I don't understand them, and I don't have to understand them in order to use them and to use them well to get them to work for me. So it seems that I don't understand where's my hands? I don't understand. Generally, most people do not understand how technology works, whether that be electricians or people who design these things understand them to work. Or even I don't even understand how they work in terms of like the basic science, as in like the kind of nature of reality. I don't understand how they work with regards to that, but they work just as fine. And that's all I kind of need to. I kind of need to know like the top kind of level. I don't have to understand the bottom one to get this to work. So you could have the kind of Christian morality up here without really understanding where it comes from or even what it's based in, right? And you can get that to work just fine. And he provides no reason at all. Firstly, it doesn't logically follow, immediately follow from that. So he needs some sort of argument to explain why that's the case. And he doesn't explain in either case why it's necessary for the state to do that in order to have that sort of morality, and that this sort of morality is the only kind that provides either the only working society or the best kind of working of society. Yeah.
10 minutes.
It's terrible.
It's not every day I'm the progressive. Oh, what? Here?
Yeah? Oh, nice. Okay. I'm not used to arguing for more freedoms against conservatives on stage, but I guess that's where we're at right now with the conservative movement, or whatever part of the conservative movement this is. Today, we've got viewers gathered from all across the world tuning in to a debate between me and Milo, where Milo is going to argue that we should turn the USA into an isolated, authoritarian, zealously religious country. I think that technology is the Pandora's box that has changed this country and this world forever, and I don't think we're ever going back to the days of public squares and mail service by horse. Cultural exchange is happening, whether you like it or not, quite literally at the speed of light. Even right now, potentially hundreds of thousands or even millions of people around the world are listening to me and Milo have this debate. The only way to stop this type of cultural exchange is through the militant authoritarianism that Milo is talking about on this stage. That might be through his being against the First Amendment, that might be against his taking away of the Second Amendment, and that might be through the institution of a state religion. This means the destruction of our freedom of speech, our ability to produce media, satire, and comedy, and our ability to communicate openly on the social media platforms we've all unfortunately grown addicted to. After Milo gets his way and abolishes the First Amendment, is he going to be the one deciding who we can or cannot make fun of on Twitter? Is the world really going to return to how it was before birth control, before women had the right to work, before gay people were allowed to get married, before we were allowed the ability to freely worship whatever God we wanted, or abstain from worship altogether? I reckon that we cannot close Pandora's box. Christian nationalism, as it stands today, isn't even a coherent ideology. Its proponents will argue whether there's an ethnic component, whether one needs to be Catholic or not, and whether one needs to even be a Christian or a supporter at all in order to idolize somebody for a Christian nationalist ideology. How many more porn stars does Donald Trump need to work his way through behind his wife's back before Christian nationalists stop worshiping him as their savior? As small as Christian nationalism is as a movement, even with it being as small as it is, there is still endless infighting. Anyone who's taken a gander recently at Milo, Ali Alexander, or Fuentes' Telegram account can attest to that. And now, with an already fractured and fighting minority movement, some want to put even more restrictions, such as race, lineage, sexuality, LGBT status, or geography on who ought to be allowed to join their movement. The glory days of Christianity are largely over. While the number of worshipers have ebbed and flowed through time, it's impossible for us to return to where we came from. In 1999, almost 70% of Americans were part of a church, synagogue, or mosque. And just 20 years later, in 2020, according to Pew Research, that number has fallen to just 47%, a minority of the population for the first time in U.S. history. We need to be realistic about the coming years. We need to help our young men and women find purpose in the world and stop pretending like some Christian nationalism is the answer. We need to find ways to get our young people engaged with their friends, family, and their communities in ways that synergize with the technological explosion the entire world has experienced. If Christian nationalists want to continue to practice Christianity in America, then I say we let them. However, we should never allow them to take away our right not to do the same.
All right. There's I think 3 points there. I'm thinking about. So the first point, the first point Destiny raises is that he presents this sort of fatalist picture that the reason that you cannot have a Christian nationalism. Oh, does he say you can't? Or that would be very difficult to. Or that would be very immoral too. So there's like three things there. The strongest one, arguably, is it the strongest one? I suppose the strongest version would be you cannot have a kind of Christian nationalism because technology has produced a world in such that there is no way to effectively control individuals from not being Christian, for lack of a better term. The second one is that it would be immoral to do that because you would have to coerce people, which seems to suggest that you can do it, that the state could actually succeed in doing this, but just shouldn't. It's obviously different from saying that it just simply can't do it. What's the third one? Oh, it doesn't matter. I think those two are fine. Although it'd be just incredibly difficult. So the first, I think the kind of, I think there's something to what I'm about to say, but it's weak and it's more of an ad hominem to the position. I think it doesn't really attack it. Is that in saying that it is inevitable, that it is impossible to go backwards, is a sort of naivete or a kind of arrogance or kind of fatalism about what technology does and its relationship to morality. I would certainly say that there's probably a very strong correlation between kind of moral concepts and understandings becoming more refined as technology has improved. But I wouldn't say, or at least I think it would be much more difficult to say, that it is because of technology that our moral concepts and understandings have become refined because of that. So what's the first problem? What's the first problem here? The first problem is that it's not entirely. It doesn't seem true that it is a Pandora's box that's been opened. First of all, because we can see states existing even today that are able to roll back these sorts of liberal progressive values and still have this sort of technology floating around. So obviously, something like China is a classic example of a very strong state that is able to keep people's kind of economic and civil freedoms limited. Another example would be arguably Afghanistan, which again exists in a world in which this technology exists. They have this technology, and yet the moment America left Afghanistan, women were banned from going to school or university, I think, or something to that effect. Presumably that is a step backward, even though that state exists with the sorts of technology we're talking about. Another example is Russia. Russia has taken massive steps backwards, particularly with regards to gay rights. I can't remember precisely, but it's either banned now. I'd have to look it up. But the idea is this is a state that exists with these sorts of technologies, and it has effectively gone backwards and is attempting to go further backwards. So it doesn't seem obviously true that just because we have technology or just because technology advances that we become more liberal, or even if we become more liberal, that bleeds into our kind of laws and the government or state that rules over us. So that seems false. Or at least, I mean, you could say that it's inevitable, but that also strikes me as particularly Hegelian. It's pretty gross to me, but you might also think that sort of attitude of thinking this is inevitable breeds complacency, which allows these sorts of movements to kind of get in and take over, because you just think they'll just fail because technology will solve it for some reason. So that's obviously false. The other problem is that Destiny is understanding Christian nationalism as something from a bygone era. And that's true insofar as historically. But there's no reason to think that some sort of modern version of a kind of Christian nationalist government couldn't happen. There's no reason to think that. Why? Well, through the exact same kind of technological tools that he thinks liberates us, are the same sorts of things that can allow us to be monitored, ruled, and surveillance. So obviously, the surveillance problem that Edward Snowden revealed shows us that even a liberal democracy uses these technologies to spy on their civilian, other citizens. And just a cursory look at the AI ethics field about how algorithms are used to generate bias or accidentally generate bias, are allowed to monitor people, etc., etc. It's very clear that a creative Christian nationalist would just look at this technology as a way of monitoring and controlling individuals as opposed to just liberating them. And all it needs to do is kind of get its hands on it. We see this in China, we see this in Russia, that the internet exists, it can be turned off, which was what happened with Iran, which is why we don't get much information out of them about their current civil strife. So it doesn't strike me as a very good argument because things do go backwards, as I've cited from the current examples in world history. This technology is already used by liberal democracies to curtail our freedoms and surveil us, so there's no reason to think a country that would be authoritarian in some way would do the same thing to a greater extent. So that really kind of blows that argument down, because it blows down you can't do this because of technology, because people do, and they could. It seems obvious. Or it seems that there's a good reason to think that. Now, the moral argument, he doesn't present any sort of moral argument for why they shouldn't, right? A kind of robust or staunch Christian nationalist or authoritarian of any kind of sort could just say, well, just because something's hard to do doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And just because it can't be done doesn't mean that the best possible world, that utopia, that the most just society wouldn't be the one I'm talking about. So that argument, like that entire kind of technology argument, or against kind of authoritarianism, I think just utterly fails. It's probably got something to it, I think, but I don't think it would take a bit more. It would take a lot more work, I think, to make something good out of it. The other one was the division. This idea that just because a Christian nationalist just because the kind of cluster of families that belong to Christian nationalism have different views about how to kind of cash out what it means to be Christian nationalist, or how they would structure the society. Some sort of argument against why America shouldn't be. Again, I mean, just looking at a democratic system, like all the different parties, whether the primary ones or the third parties, all these parties, they all disagree with each other. They disagree with how the world ought to be structured. Even within these kinds of families, you see arguments. For Australia, the Liberal Party is a coalition. You can see the same thing happening like the Democratic Party. We see the same thing happening in the Republican Party with like Trumpists and like the more standard Republicans. And there's probably and then there's libertarians that belong to that kind of group. And it seems that even when you have this kind of disagreements, these places can still function. And even when they don't agree, with enough kind of coercion or violence, you could force them to. So, what's an example of that? Just think of something like, what happened to Germany with Hitler, right? A bunch of disagreements, different disagreements about how to do things, and eventually one party, just through kind of force of will and a bit of luck and complacency from others, was kind of allowed to take over. Minority, sure, although, look, I don't know much about the history, but they weren't exactly like a huge majority. Doesn't matter, they were still able to do it. I presume something like the revolution in Russia with Lenin possibly falls into the same sort of category, in which you have these different types of Marxists arguing about what's the correct understanding of Marxists. A socialist society can't exist in something like Russia because the kind of material conditions aren't set yet. And yet, even though he was the Bolsheviks, he was literally the minority, he was able to forge or topple the government of Russia and establish a new society, even though his particular type of socialism or communism was a minority. So it's not true that just because there's division that a type of movement can't come about, and just because there's division doesn't mean a society would not better function if it were like that. So even if it were true that these sort of societies with a Christian nationalist movement were divided, and they couldn't ever kind of set themselves up because of squabbling, doesn't follow from that that a better society than one exists today, would be one that would exist under theirs. So again, these are technical problems, but practical problems about how something like this might occur. They don't attack the theory or the underlying moral principles about whether it would be better or good, etc., if these societies existed. Final point that he brings up is purpose. Presumably, what he means by purpose. Well, it's not entirely clear what Destiny means by purpose. It's not entirely clear. So he seems to understand. He seems to think that the problem with a liberal society, or the problem with a liberal democracy, is it allows people to pursue their own ends. Because people have to pursue their own ends, liberal democracies are impotent with regards to providing some sort of purpose for your life. And that this might be a problem, but we can solve this within a liberal democracy. Again, that might be true, that might be all fine and dandy, but it, again, doesn't show that makes a better society, or a more working society, whatever that means, than a Christian nationalist one. So he actually has a lot of work to do with regards to any of these points. I think someone who wasn't high, and someone who wasn't just pure flash and no substance could have really knocked these down quite quickly, as I have done. Now, to be clear, I agree that a world under a kind of a liberalism is a much better working society than a Christian nationalist one. But these are not my reasons, and these are not good ones. They all seem to fail. Quite clearly, I think. But hey, I could be wrong.
We will now have 5 minutes of rebuttals from each of you guys. So we'll start with Milo. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. If the movement, such as it is, I didn't realize there was one, but if Christian nationalism is not yet adequately defined, it's because nobody used it before 2 years ago, which it seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. Trump is not a religious leader in any sense, and you're making a classic mistake of people who don't understand religion, don't understand God, and don't understand their own country when you say, hold Trump up as a kind of moral example. Render unto Caesar. We don't expect that our presidents should be like Jesus because they're not here to do Jesus's job. So, no. It's interesting you talk about women's rights. I mean, Christianity is the...
Did he talk about women's rights? I don't recall him saying anything specifically about that.
Sorry, I mean... I just don't know how hard to go in, really. I mean, you're talking about the religion that gave women consent in marriage. You're talking about the religion that gave women the right to say no, that elevated them from chattel into human beings. You want to return women to chattel. You want women to be like your wife, passed around town. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to take moral lectures on the rights of women from somebody who treats supposedly their wife in what ought to be a holy sacrament as a communal sex toy. Give me a break. Give me a break. I'm not going to take moral lectures from somebody who, for all intents and purposes, may as well have a fleshlight instead of a wife, who demeans and besmirches her honor, who speaks about a woman who should be treated with the reverence and respect and love that we treat our own mothers with, like she was something you could buy, like she's something that just to get off with.
So obviously this is all tasteless and, quite frankly, irrelevant. It doesn't show at all why America would be better as a Christian nation. Second of all, seems a little weird to say that one should treat one's wife like one would treat one's mother. That strikes me as a little counterintuitive, and a little gross. Yeah. So he's clearly lost it. Yeah.
Passed around to other men while you watch, flicking yourself off. So forgive me if I decline to take any lectures from you on women's bloody rights. As for gay rights, no thanks. I didn't want them when I was having sex with men, and I don't want them now. Catholicism and Islam are growing, in case you aren't familiar with the world outside these borders. And the reason for that is that everybody sees what a bloody mess we're all in, thanks to globalization, thanks to the information economy, thanks to the kinds of changes that he says are inexorable, because, like a lot of undereducated people, he doesn't have much of a grasp of the world before he was born. I think if you were to glance a little further back, whether it were to ancient Greece or Rome or the Holy Roman Empire, you would see plenty of examples in history, or even, dare I say it, the Weimar Republic. A little bit closer to our own era, in which an era of rampant sexual degeneracy was indeed replaced by some quite stern social rules, to put it mildly. History is replete with examples of what happens when the public gets sick of people like you, fucking everything up, breaking everything apart, and destroying all the things that make society precious, that make relationships work. In fact, if you are to look back in history as far as Greece and Rome, you might say that history is really the story of how people like you, given undue influence and larger platforms than they deserve, continually express views that are so far outside of the mainstream and so out of step with what ordinary people think that you have to be regularly slaughtered, and new governments have to be installed, and coups have to be engaged in, just to keep people like you in line, because otherwise we'd all be dead. So I'm sorry, but I'm certainly not going to take any kind of moral lectures from you on anything. But I've given you a few examples of why everything you just said is complete and absolute nonsense. But let me tell you, if your memory stretches back, and as you're a university or an educated person, it should be further than 1980. Yeah, you absolutely can put it back in the box. And we must, and we should, because otherwise America is done.
All right, Des.
Okay. So he beat on his wife. Classic deflection tactic. Again, it has nothing to do with the topic. Why does it have nothing to do with the topic? Well, it's because even if everything he said was true, it doesn't follow that from that America would be better as a Christian nation. It doesn't follow at all. So it doesn't matter. The other thing so he brings up the point that society needs to be maintained to a certain degree. Persons who are, I'll use the word degenerate, people who are degenerates disrupt society such that it stops working. Therefore, when it's justified, it seems to me he wants to say something like, when he was talking about coups, when he was talking about revolutions, when he was talking about sorts of political upheavals in which some government is which some sort of state is overthrown and a new one takes over. The idea, I think, was that if society reaches such a point in which it feels like it's no longer working, that when it's morally justified in murdering, in killing these sorts of people, whoever they might be. Again, doesn't follow that the world or that America would be better as a Christian nation. Because the liberal Democrat could just say, right, you just bring in more kinds of laws that stop certain kinds of behavior, such that it curves these sorts of things. It might even have to be laws. You can bring in types of taxations. So, for example, suppose you thought that too much, but for some reason, how do I put this? We can imagine a world in which there is some sort of causal relationship between promiscuity and laziness. Suppose that. We can imagine a world in which that was the case. We can imagine a world in which when people pursue sexual desires and fulfill them, they become extremely tired. So tired, in fact, they can't work. So people can't work is they can't build things or make things or provide goods and services to other persons, and that this reduces the amount of goods and services that exist in a society such that prices go up. The other people begin to starve, say, or whatever. So we can imagine that. Suppose something like that. Suppose that. It's so fucking stupid. You might think, oh no, if that's the case, maybe we should curve in this imagined non-existent world, in this possible world. We should curve these sorts of behaviors so that people have the energy to work and produce goods and services to other people. Doesn't mean you have to outlaw promiscuity, right? You could put taxation on types of birth control, for example, such that this encourages people or disencourages them to pursue these sorts of activities. So again, doesn't follow at all that you need to impose a state religion in order to get people to behave in such a way in which you would desire them to have a working society, whatever that is. And of course, the counterpoint obviously is also like, even if you had this state-imposed religion, it doesn't follow from that people are going to behave the way you want them to. As Destiny, I think, rightly points out, you would need to coerce them with threat of violence in order to get them to do it, and this would require significant government overreach. Well, if I just describe it as overreach and begging the question, but you would require considerable oversight on civilian lives. The other point I think that is perhaps more interesting is the point he raises, which is that, look, according to Milo, if you look at the world outside America, religiosity is actually increasing. That according to him, that more people are converting to Catholicism and Islam. I don't know if that's true. Intuitively, that seems not quite right, but I don't know. Doesn't seem to me much hinges upon that. So there's two problems, his view there. One is that if it is the case, we already have a counterpoint to his worldview, which is, you could say, Islam, right? You could argue that, well, if people are flocking to Islam in the same way they're flocking to Catholicism, it seems that Islam then is a functioning or a working society, otherwise it would have fallen apart by now. It hasn't, so maybe we would be better under Islam. That's the way you could go with that. I wouldn't. That immediately throws up a problem with his own case. The second issue is that even if that's true, again, it doesn't follow, right? Why? Well, the idea for liberal democracy is that a person can pursue their own ends, and that people are just choosing under this particular system that is neutral about these sorts of values, but how to live their lives. They're kind of organizing, or they're becoming self-organizing. And you might find that that is a perfectly working society. The people are able to find what works for them, in this case, Islam and Catholicism, and then pursue those ends. Doesn't mean that you need a state religion in order to make people better, because they seem to be choosing to be better. Well, if you think these things are better, they're choosing these things because they think they're better, and that works. That is completely compatible with liberal democracy. Indeed, you might say it's like the defining strength is that a person can choose their own ends. and they can choose these ends. They don't have to be mandated. And arguably, when someone comes to the good of their own volition, of their own freedom, they choose it. That is much better, morally speaking, for them to choose the good rather than be forced to do it. So, for example, me forcing you to give up money for someone else's health and safety. You might think that that's a good thing to do, for me to force you or threaten you with violence or steal from you to do that. But it would clearly be better for you to choose of your own volition to give money away to help someone's health and safety. Yeah, so that's also a really shit argument. Another kind of argument that Robert Nozick offers in his last chapter of Anarchy-State Utopia, without attempting to beg the question in favour of liberalism, is that, look, what liberal democracies do, or these sorts of like state morally neutral states do, is that they allow a kind of filtering process to occur between all the different kinds of ways of living to eventually find the one that works best. So liberal democracy offers a kind of filtering device that over time will allow the better working systems to kind of rise to the top. What do I mean by this? Well, the idea is like, look, people are complicated. If you could, if you want to pause this and write down a list of 60 different people from all different various parts of society, you can imagine just any 60 people. These people are going to be very different. These kind of people are going to have very different interests. And even if they have the same interests or values, they're probably going to weigh them differently, right? Someone might value being free, and someone might value the personal well-being. But they might not weigh these things the same way, even if they both agree on them being the same, like the same sorts of values that they hold. So it's hard to imagine that a good moral working world would be one in which there is some sort of like perfect world view, a single world view that's going to accommodate all of these individuals to make them all live the best possible lives to produce a functioning society. And, it's arguably an empirical question about what's the best way to live, what's the best kind of society. So the best you can do is kind of like, instead of mandating it from the top, or presuming that something that has stopped working, because Christian nationalism has stopped working, it hasn't worked for a very, very fucking long time. And there's no reason to presume that it can keep working unless you update it. It seems we have filtered these kinds of things out. Now, people are flocking to a new type of Catholic state, which they're not. They're flocking to a religion, not a Christian nationalist state. They're flocking towards Islam. All that tells us is that maybe these are good ways of living, but we would not have discovered this unless we had a liberal democracy that was morally neutral about these sorts of topics and just allowed people to kind of figure out of their own accord what the best kind of working society for them is. So what's interesting about this point, and again, so the idea is like his sort of Catholicism that he's offering, or Catholicism in general, is completely compatible with a liberal democracy. So liberal democracy offers a kind of meta-utopia, a kind of filtering device that allows the right kinds, or the best kinds of ways for people to organize their lives to kind of rise to the top. That's the idea. And yeah, so why is that important? Well, it's not entirely clear that if you'd had a mandated morality from the top, we would have ever discovered that. And again, even if living with a Catholic worldview makes for a better society, it doesn't follow from that a government should mandate that people live like that. It's probably going to always be outliers, and these outliers are going to organize their lives differently, right? And maybe that's not as good, but they're going to do it differently. And if you mandate them live a certain kind of way, it might actually cause more disruption than just leaving them be to do their own thing. So he needs to, again, stress that why we should think that just because people convert to a particular religion, if they do, why that tells us anything about how the state should organize itself. Doesn't tell us anything. Doesn't tell us anything at all.
So you have 5 minutes for your rebuttal.
I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to respond to. I think it's a little funny that apparently I'm so far outside of what people regularly think, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure I'm giving you a bigger audience than you've had in the past several years post your cancellation.
It's a personal attacks. Yeah.
But I see that this is what the dying throes, I guess, of an internet provocateur, as he self-described himself back when you were writing on the alt-right, then when you were writing on Trump. Now I guess you're not writing on guys anymore because apparently you prayed away the gay. So whatever you're doing now. But I won't get into all that. I'll take the high road, despite the fact that you're one of the most obsessed with my wife's vagina gay guys I've ever seen in my entire life, which is very weird, but very strange. I'll kind of reiterate what I said before, I guess. I don't know how long we're going to do this, but yeah, I think that Christian nationalism is largely a joke. I guess you can kind of see that the figures that are proponents of Christian nationalism, like Christian nationalism, are largely jokes. They don't really have any serious positions. They just sit up here trying to provoke. They really have nothing to offer the public, nothing to offer the public discourse, nothing to offer the people that are, I guess, trying to join and leave these movements, because obviously, as we can see online, they are ever fracturing and ever infighting more and more every single day.
I'll let him finish. He has finished.
We'll move on to the question.
All right. So, right. I think we can largely agree with all the facts about that. Is that Christian nationalism is a joke. It isn't a serious political philosophy. Nobody I know, off the top of my head, takes it seriously. At least within academia. Although there'll be people, I just don't know who they are. But there probably won't be very many of them, I imagine. What is the problem with what he said? So in terms of Christian nationalists don't provide any practical solutions to problems. That's largely true. But they don't really. The aim isn't about that, right? What they're attempting to sell is an idea, right? They're attempting to sell that there is a way in which society can be organized under this view that will make society better, more workable for the people in it. It's not entirely clear what that kind of shakes out to look like. You can kind of do these broad strokes to kind of get the theory going. And that can be enough to kind of motivate people into agreeing with it. So although they might not have answers to how much one should tax such and such, or how we should mitigate laws about traffic violations, but even then, that's not entirely. I mean, it's not entirely what's at stake here, right? What's at stake here is that is there some sort of conception of this view that would be better than any type of conception of a liberal view, right? That is kind of what the point is here. Yeah, I mean, you could also throw the same sort of thing at a liberal democracy, right? So, for example, liberal democracy says that people should kind of like be able to pursue their own ends, whatever ends they might be, and that they should respect other person's civil and economic rights and private property, blah, 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 blah. In the same way, like a liberal democracy in terms of like that doesn't offer like any sort of practical solutions of itself, right? You need to start kind of digging in. And this is what these sorts of debates in public policy and political philosophy and ethics are about, is attempting to wrestle with how do we cash out these kinds of more practical problems. And the Christian nationalist can just say the same thing, right? You can just say, sure, like there's different conceptions. That doesn't mean that they're not offered, right? We just disagree about what is the correct one to do. And because we're such a small group, the striking differences are more obvious because there's so few of us. And that seems like, to me at least, a perfectly reasonable argument against it, against Destiny's point. Yeah, he didn't really have obviously much to say. Again, the point I think that he would need to press, like just fucking, just a surgical strike, is just to say everything you have said does not show at all that a society would be better right? Either working or more virtuous, etc. If religion was state mandated, right, doesn't follow like at all. You need to show that. You need to show that. Um, and you've got nothing.
Right now, the person who I will direct a question towards has 5 minutes to respond, and then the opponent has 3 minutes to respond to that. Then the first question is for Milo. As we know, Christianity has a lot of denominations, and even amongst your faith, Catholicism, there are lots of conflicting interpretations of the Bible and other differing opinions. How would you, in your Christian Nationalist society, coexist with non-Catholics?
You don't have to, I mean, my patron saint, Louis IX, the only canonized king of France, says that, he knows what's coming already. There must be Elijah, I've been warned about you. Said that it wasn't really proper to debate these kinds of things, and it's better to run somebody through with a sword than to hear them besmirch the faith or whatnot. But if you think that coexistence with Christians is such an onerous and dreadful burden, perhaps you might like to tell the Jews, who seem to quite like it. In fact, Jews and Christians, it seems to me, do best in the sort of situation that you have in the West, with a Christian governing majority and a Jewish minority, so that we don't all get too super serious and up ourselves. And we have some good new interpretations of Mendelssohn now and again. There aren't any conflicting interpretations of the Bible in Catholicism. There is only church teaching, and church teaching is eternal. Unless some pope comes along and decides that, even Francis hasn't done that he's going to rip it all up. Coexisting with Christians is the easiest thing to do in the world. And I can't remember who gave this example, but if you heard footsteps, this is not my analogy, but if you heard footsteps coming up behind you in a dark alley at night, would you feel safer if you knew that it was Dylan Mulvaney or any church-going Christian?
Wait, is that it?
Right? For
what do you do with that? The question was, how would non-Christians work within this society? Doesn't really answer that except with, hey, just fucking kill them, right? That's what he hints at the start, and then he rambles about nothing relevant at all. Again, whether you are morally justified in killing someone who disagrees with you about something that you take to be quite serious. For me, that's highly counterintuitive. It doesn't seem to me to be a good enough reason to take another's life or violate the rights in any sort of way. Of course, you might ask, well, why, Chad? Fair. I need to think about that a bit more seriously, but I think most of us have a very strong intuition that just a legitimate disagreement about values or about the nature of reality isn't enough to violate someone's individual rights or to damage their property or to grievously bodily harm them. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just like, maybe I'm just a little too liberal.
For Destiny, you have 3 minutes now to respond to that.
I'm sorry, can you read the prompt again?
Yeah, sure. As we know, Christianity has a lot of denominations. Even amongst your faith, Catholicism, Milo's faith, there are lots of conflicting interpretations of the Bible. How would your Christian Nationalist society coexist with non-Catholics?
Well, I mean, the society that I advocate for is the one that exists today, where people are allowed to worship whatever religion they want. I think that right now, America is superior to a Christian nationalist version of it, because if two different people decide they want to worship two different versions of Christianity, they have the right to do that. Obviously, in Milo's world, I guess the non-Catholics even, I think, would get killed. I don't know how many, where the killing starts and stops for his version of Christian nationalism, or ethnically, I don't know where that starts or stops. I heard the run through the sword thing. Maybe you forgot what you said. I'm not sure what you were doing in the bathroom while we were waiting for you for 20 minutes here, but maybe it's affecting your memory a little bit. But yeah, I think in the United States, I think one of the reasons why the United States works as well as it does is because we've allowed so many different people to come here, worship in the way that we want, or worship in the way that they want, and we should continue to allow them to do so.
40 minutes is a terribly...
Okay, totally agree with everything you said. Doesn't show that society is better. You would require something more than that. Again, ways of offering that is ways in which you could describe that by not mandating a kind of purpose or a morality onto people, they have to choose their own. This you might think is a type of, in kind of following John Stuart Mill, type of character development in which someone gets to, of their own volition, develop the person who they wish to be. They effectively get to exercise their higher cognitive faculties to produce a kind of character. You might find that very attractive. You might think a bunch of individuals who have unique talents and skills and character, who all respect each other's rights and see in each other the uniqueness that they have developed, if they've developed it at all, because they don't have to. You might think that that makes a really good society, a society of unique and talented individuals, and that we can each benefit from each other from that division of character, a division of labor and talents. And yeah, that seems to lean into a kind of understanding of like markets. So yeah, right. So one, you know, that's what, yeah, maybe that's a bit off topic. That's fine. That's fine. Doesn't matter. I'm rambling. He would need to present a bit more than that. A liberal society also offers a way in which there's a filtering device. So a liberal democracy, if everyone became Muslim under a liberal democracy, that's perfectly fine under this view. And if it became more Catholics, that would be fine. And if they became more atheists, what would matter is that they've chosen and not being coerced into doing so. And that if these are the type of societies that would merge out, right, and that they're working, then that is a tick in favour of a kind of liberal democracy. So far as we know, Christian nationalism doesn't work because every time it's been tried, if it's been tried, it hasn't, because it's fallen apart in the end, and nobody's tried it since.
A long time to do a line of coke.
Oh, of course, and you know, how would non-Catholics do under a Catholic mandated religion? Well, you know, you could just tax them all. That's the way of doing things. That's generally the way I think it's been done historically. Or you could just fucking kill them all in a video game. No, you would actually not do that in a video game. You would just wipe them out. Seems to be what Milo was hinting at, but he cleverly phrased it in terms of besmirching the faith, which allows him to pivot in a very Gricean fashion to say that that's not what I meant. What I meant was just that thing. Never said anything about actually killing anyone who disagrees with us. And presumably, non-Catholics or non-Christians, how you want to cash it out, would do very poorly under this system. It's not entirely clear why we should think that if one particular portion of society is doing very badly under a particular system, why we should think that system's working. When we ask if a system is working, you can ask if it's working for people, asking for groups, asking the whole. And it would seem that if you find a system that allowed for this minority group to do just as better or much better in a different one, then you would obviously say that that's a better society. So yeah, it's a live question. Of like, okay, even if it was the case that we are better under a Catholic, or that even if it were the case that, okay, you've sold me on that you require Christian morality to have a functioning society, and you've sold me on the idea that one would need to be a Catholic does not show me at all. Like, it doesn't explain to me what happens to me as a non-Christian. Yeah.
I was late. I was late for the ordinary reasons that people are late. I was at the hairdresser.
All right, Destiny.
I have the personality I have. Sort of stuck with it now.
Now your question, Destiny. You have 5 minutes to respond to this, and then I'll have 3 minutes to respond to that. Some would argue that a society without religion at its core would devolve into a nihilistic society, deprived of any meaning or purpose. How would you prevent, in your society, non-Christian nationalist governing society, from devolving into a nihilistic, meaningless society?
I think that you have to have something greater than yourself to live for, and I think religion is like a really easy package to give somebody that kind of solves for a lot of those problems. It gives you a nice guide for how to view the world, it gives you a nice guide for how to view your family, it gives you a nice guide for how to live an ethical life, and through that package, people feel like they have something greater than themselves to live for. I don't think it's impossible to have that thing without religion, but I think right now we're very politically fractured as a country, and it makes it really difficult for us to have those things. So for instance, there are certain topics that are hotly contested that I don't think should be. So for instance, all of us should be able to say we're proud to be Americans. That includes progressives, that includes BLM people, that includes people on the left, it includes anybody that might, however far left you go, you should be able to say that. That shouldn't be ground that we cede to people on the right. I think it's kind of a shame that if you see an American flag on somebody's car today, you basically know that they're a conservative because nobody on the left would put that on their car. I think that's an insane proposition. So I think that when we've gotten to this point to where we're so politically divided that people can't even feel proud of their country anymore, if you also take away religion from those people too, then they're kind of aimlessly, I guess, wandering from Twitter to Facebook to YouTube to whatever, just endlessly shitting on each other with no common united purpose. So I think that one of the things we need to work on more than anything else is kind of healing some of the political fracture that exists in this country. I think it's good that we argue with each other, but it's not good that we are relentlessly banning people from every platform so that we're all kind of like gathering in different areas and we're not even able to have conversations with each other in the same reality anymore.
Okay, cool. That didn't answer the question. That didn't answer the question. Yeah, but what did he say? There should be something that unites us. Well, that unites the group in order for them to exist, and religion allows that to happen. Sure does. What? Something important to be said here, but I can't quite get it out. We need something to unite us. We can do that with a religion, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so Destiny's quite right, I think, in saying that religions offer a kind of complete package. They are quite coherent, well, maybe they're not coherent, comprehensive, that'd be a more accurate word. Religions are a comprehensive worldview. And what does that mean? It means that they solve kind of value problems and they solve metaphysical problems. With regards to the value problems, religions or faiths or worldviews offer a reason for being. They offer a reason for why there is something rather than nothing. They offer a way of deciding between what one ought to do and what one ought not to do. So they solve for practical reasoning to some extent, or can be seen to do so. And they solve metaphysical problems about the nature of reality, what exists, how it exists, etc., etc. Now, in saying that, it is not true that just by buying into a religion that all of those problems are solved. All you need to do is have a cursory glance at even just the Catholic faith or the Jewish faith. There's a cursory glance at the literature, philosophy of religion, or theological works about how law should be interpreted, what they're supposed to mean, how they're supposed to work, how these purported values that are revealed to us through Scripture, how they connect with the divine, if they can connect at all. etc., etc. And even people who are united with the basic belief of, say, God existing, and in this case, that Christ is God incarnate on earth. Even if you accept that, you can still very much disagree about these problems about why we're here, how these values connect up with anything, or the nature of reality. What they do offer, I think, better is a kind of framework for thinking about these sorts of things. So they offer a kind of framework to think about these problems that solve a number of them, or that at least offer starting points into solving them and connect them with something greater and something fundamental about the nature of reality. Or they purport to, at least. And his idea, I guess, is that the non-religious views don't exist, or if they do, they're impoverished. That seems false. The first thing, although you might think that they have the element of religiosity, what they do that. The thing about something like Marxism, right? Marxism offers a kind of comprehensive worldview about how the world works, what its basic kind of components are, and what's right and wrong, and basically how to solve kind of practical problems, or how kind of help provide guidance on like practical reasoning. These sorts of worldviews, like Marxism and other types of kinds of political philosophy, I think effective altruism to some extent can kind of start to satisfy some of these kind of criteria. They seem to exist. And that seems to be fine. Again, yeah, I'm not sure what I'm saying here. Like, yeah, what he said didn't really connect with the question. But presumably my answer to that question would be, well, these systems already exist. Marxism is one, liberal democracy is another, effective altruism. You could say things like types of consequentialism, types of natural rights theories, blah, 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 blah. They offer a worldview, and indeed many philosophers of the past have attempted to provide comprehensive worldviews about why we're here, how morality works, and what's the basic nature of reality. And you could just take one of those, and arguably we already do develop our world.
Look at the societies that Christians build. I mean, earlier he says, "Oh, you get rid of the First Amendment, and there goes satire." Again, apparently a memory that doesn't stretch back before 1980, because I think most of the best satirists were Christian Europeans, weren't they? And before that, they were pagans, and we live in a very Hellenistic kind of a inheritance, and it was just complete and total bollocks. And you've been doing a lot of complete and total bollocks, assigning positions to me that I don't hold, and saying, "Oh, he wants to murder everyone, he wants to kill all the blacks." No.
Never said that.
No. Look at the societies that Christians build. Look at the things they build. In Catholic theology, there's a thing called the transcendentals, and it's supposedly
The truly good and the
things that
beautiful.
all souls have in common, that all people yearn for, and which brings us closer to an understanding of God. Now, opinions differ on how many of these things there are, but the core three that everyone agrees on is beauty, truth, and goodness. And it seems to me that if you look at the frescoes in Italy, or you listen to German composers, or look at Dutch painting, that we in Western Christian Europe have done a pretty good job of embracing beauty, truth, and goodness, and also self-sacrifice and sacrifice for love, which is the central image of Christianity. Feuerbach, the philosopher who was not a Christian, did not like Christians at all, said that you can sort of tell what a culture's all about from its religion's kind of central symbol. Ours is Christ on the cross, dying for someone you love. It's Tristan and Isolde. It's all the things that we think are most noble. It's sending people to war to die for their country. All of those values, all those things we love, rest on the image of Christ on the cross. We are good only because we have learned goodness from Christianity. And we can insist in a prideful way that, oh, no, I'm good because I made myself good, because I got there through reason. All right, mate. Just look at the societies that Christians build, and you tell me where you want to live. Is it Abu Dhabi? Is it the Congo? Is it Sparta? Or is it Western Europe, maybe 50 years ago? I know where I'd rather be.
Okay, well, again, that didn't respond to the question. I didn't respond to what Destiny said, but then again, I didn't respond to it. I couldn't really kind of like articulate anything interesting about what Destiny said. Again, I mean, and I'll keep repeating this point, is that even if that's true, that the right kind of morality to make a functioning working society is Christian, even if that is true, it doesn't follow from that the state must mandate Christianity as a religion in order to facilitate that. It doesn't follow at all. You need some sort of evidence to show that that's the case. And it seems to me, as I think Destiny rightly points out, that a number of things that are deeply held, particularly with Americans, such as the First and Second Amendment, would have to be utterly crushed for this sort of system to kind of work, right? Because when you mandate, what a government is, at least what I think a government is, or a state, is that it is a monopoly on violence that effectively says, you will do as I say, or I will hurt you. And how they choose to hurt might be financially, might be a violation of your rights in terms of limiting your freedoms, or it might end up being in literal physical violence in which you are physically harmed and emotionally scarred. That's effectively what a state is. So when you mandate a religion from the top, right, when you say that this is a Christian world, this is a Christian state, and that the people within here need to act in this manner, that means that you need to coerce them into doing it, right? And this means that they cannot talk against it, that they cannot say things that are contrary to what the state thinks. So I think a point that someone brought up earlier, and again Destiny brings up, is that people disagree, even within these families, disagree vehemently about how we ought to kind of cash out these sorts of things. So you end up having, like, if you have a Christian nation, it's not just that it is Christian, but it is someone's interpretation of what they take to be the correct interpretation to be, right? And other people are going to disagree. So it's not just Christianity, it's kind of hoisted onto people. Someone's particular conception, right? And their particular conception needs to be followed. And if it's not, that means that they need some sort of way to force people to do it, right? Because if you can't enforce a law, then the law just isn't a thing, right? Right. So there are many laws that have been. What's a good one? Something like maybe prohibition might be a good example. Is that here is a wide-reaching law attempting to control people's behaviour, but it's still unmanageable. The law is effectively impotent. This kind of undermines the state's authority, which is something arguably the state does not want to do. Yeah, I've lost my train of thought. So yeah, you would need to crush, like, satire would exist under a Christian nationalist, could exist under a Christian nationalist worldview. It just would not at all adhere to how we understand, or how we generally understand, the First Amendment, which is freedom of expression. Because how would the satire exist? Well, you could just make fun of other worldviews, right? You can make fun of Islam in a Christian nationalist world. Presumably that would be acceptable satire, but not just any satire would go, right? So you would have to crush that amendment. You would arguably have to take guns away from persons who are not Christians, assuming you even allowed non-Christians to live in a society in which you made. You might think the society can't work if there's people who don't adhere to the worldview. And so you would have to jettison them, or simply curtail their freedoms even more. Which is clearly a violation of both First and Second Amendment. And that's just the first two. You could go down the line. Yeah, as regards to this idea that, first of all, would you rather live in this world or that world? I think that's cool. I think that hurts his case more than it helps it, because people have very different ideas about what sort of world they would want to live in. So following kind of Nozick again, imagine a way in which, imagine this, imagine an existence in which whatever world you could think of could come into existence, and that you could live in that world, and you could populate that world with people. There's only two kinds of rules. There's only kind of two rules to this. One, although you get to choose the people, you cannot coerce them into staying. That is to say that they can imagine a world and then leave yours for theirs, right? And the other thing that you can't do is you can't kind of violate their rights. So now you've got this kind of thing where if anyone imagines a world that they would rather live in, they can go to that, right? And if you write down, if you ask people to write down on a piece of paper what sort of world they would want to go into, what sort of world they would imagine, you're going to get a very different list. Very different. It's not clear at all that someone is going to say they'd rather exist in this world than America 50 years ago. Because there certainly will be people who say that. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether we would be better off, whether America specifically would be better off as a Christian nation. Because there are arguably going to be people who are going to say, no, I would prefer not to live in a world from 50 years ago. I would prefer a world in which I can construct or find people who share my values and move into that world. I would rather do that, which means living now. This is better than that. If we're talking 50 years ago, we're talking like clearly minorities, women. We're talking like more than 50% of the population would prefer to live now than 50 years ago. And that's just like, just thinking about minorities, thinking about women, thinking about gays. You know, there's going to be small pockets, presumably, who would rather live in more oppressive times for them. That's fine, that's their choice. If they want to do that, that's fine. But presumably most of the people in that group wouldn't. So just women, that's 50%, wouldn't go back, or if they did, it would be very small. And then, of course, people like me, and presumably Destiny, and there's probably other white men who would prefer not to go back to times like that, because we like the world that we live in now, for whatever reason. That's a shit argument. Another really bad argument that he makes here is this idea that the true, the good, and the beautiful are best pursued within a Christian nationalist state. Though he doesn't say that, he says Christianity best serves pursuing the transcendental, which is the true, the good, and the beautiful. I think there's some. Oh, look, I mean, I'm tipping my hand here, but I might want to agree with him at least on that. But again, if you're a committed secularist, but again, to be clear, even if that were the case, doesn't show the Christian nationalist world or a Christian nationalist state be the best organization of society such we realize these goals. That doesn't follow. The other problem is, like, well, not the problem, but if you obviously weren't committed to Christianity, and you were a secularist, you know, Mill, I think, makes quite a compelling argument that these sorts of goods can best be pursued in a liberal democracy in which people's individual liberties are respected. Because in these sorts of worlds, people can make their own choices, build their own character, and in some sense, they make their life beautiful or shape it as a kind of unique work of art according to their designs. And that, by doing that, right, they effectively choose what is good for them. They figure out what they think is good, or they look out how other people are living and they decide what they think, what they agree with is good. They begin to shape their lives. They give it a unique kind of story, a unique kind of contribution to society, if they choose to contribute to society. And you might think that's very beautiful. And allowing a kind of space in which a government does not mandate truth. Truth is best discovered by a sort of, again, a kind of filtering device in which people talk, exchange ideas, think about it, and then people naturally, of their own volition, gravitate to what they take to be true. And that is the best way of bringing about truth, goodness, and beauty. And then it just naturally arises, just with a little bit of time and a little patience, from respecting people's individual liberties of expression and self-determination and self-authorship. Um, Now, is that true? I think it's quite compelling. It seems like an empirical claim, um, but I think there's something that can be said to that really kind of just effectively, I would say, shits all over what Milo's saying here.
All right, last question for Milo, and you'll have 5 minutes to respond to this, and Destiny will have 3 minutes to respond to that. Some would argue that societies governed under one faith can devolve into tyranny. How would you prevent a Second Inquisition or a Soviet-style dictatorship with them forcing people to proclaim their allegiance to the state and faith?
Well, the Soviets are crap because they failed. I mean, they failed to do what America has accomplished, which is have people thank you for their enslavement and ask for more chains. The Soviet Union never really achieved that, but America has, with prescription drugs and all the other things that people are addicted to. I mean, everybody in this room is dependent on a cocktail, a little package, a little consumer package of things that get them through, whether it's their credit cards or gaming or whatever, passing your wife around. These are the things that sort of get you through life. I'm not terribly concerned about preventing another Inquisition. I think that'd be quite a good idea. Got a pretty bad rap, just like the Crusades does. I mean, you won't hear this from dishonest people who throw accusations at, without really listening to the arguments of their opponents and who aren't educated prior to 1980. But the Crusades were a defensive war. The Inquisition wasn't all that it's been said to be. I don't have an enormous problem with us wandering around and making sure people aren't murdering each other in the womb and making, sitting back and making money off the poor, landlords in Brooklyn. I don't have a terrible problem with that. I don't think that protecting against tyranny is the thing that America should be most concerned with at the moment. I think an urgent, strict, and perhaps stern realignment to a much more conventional morality would make everybody happier. And I don't think that anyone in this room can honestly say that America is better now than it was when most people were going to church or at least God-fearing. It isn't better. And you don't have to be a Christian to participate in a Christian society. Christians are the best of all at letting people in, sometimes too much. Sometimes the people that come in end up messing everything up. You don't have to be a Christian to benefit from a Christian society, and lots of people in this room have done exactly that. But when you take God out and things start to fall apart, you end up in a world nobody wants to live in. And we are in. Sorry?
What year? Like, you're referring to a traditional Christianity. What year are you referring to?
Just a hot tip for anyone who ever goes to a public presentation, speech, conference. Don't fucking yell out. Just don't fucking do that. Never fucking do that. It's fucking stupid and it makes you look like an idiot. It's incredibly disrespectful to the people talking. And it's disrespectful to the audience. Nobody wants to fucking hear what you have to say unless it's question time.
What do you mean?
Got me hot under the collar.
Oh, well, I mean, if I had my way, I'd go back to about 1200. Lots of...
Yeah, so Milo's kind of really tipped his hand here. This is clearly a waste of everyone's time. 1200. If you want to go live like that, that's fine. It seems, I think in most people's measurement of what a working society looks like, or a better society, the Christian nation of 1200 is not better than what exists now. I mean, I'm not even going to bother attempting to justify that. Medical improvements, individual liberties, not being murdered or dying of fucking sneezing, work opportunities, housing opportunities, clean water. I mean, it's not even remotely close. Yeah, the other thing that was obviously very revealing. Is it? Oh, maybe not. He makes this weird claim that people who aren't Christian benefit under a Christian nation. Yeah, I mean, whatever. I mean, honestly, at this point, I think I've been quite charitable. Quite charitable. This 1200 thing is crazy. Look, if you're some weird fucking Christian nationalist who wants to have some sort of state-mandated religion, I would suggest thinking about some sort of future. Right, you need to take the future into account. I think Destiny is largely correct in which technology is a Pandora's box not put back in. It can't. And you need to wrestle with that and figure out how you can make it work for you. Yeah, I mean, this is just 1200s is fucking ridiculous.
I mean, lots of propagandists in university departments call it the Dark Ages. You know, well, this is a conversation for another day, really, but it seems to me it was quite a nice time to live. And I think that you would find, if you care about this kind of thing, if you do care about things above and beyond yourself, if you care about where we go afterwards, if you care about leaving a good legacy, if you care about being good to the people around you, I think a lot more people
Meaningful life.
in 1400 got into heaven each year than do now. And I don't think you have to be a Christian to accept that that's because we're not nice anymore and we're not good to each other. And the reason for that is the failing moral architecture and underpinning of society.
Just to be clear, you being nice, as far as I understand scripture, has nothing to do with whether you get to heaven or not. That is not relevant. Yeah.
Which was required by the founders. Or
I mean, you should be nice. You should be kind. But they are not what get you into past pearly gates.
this stuff doesn't function. It's not.
All right, Destiny, you have 3 minutes to respond.
Can you hit me up with that prompt again?
Some would argue that societies governed under one faith can devolve into tyranny. How would you
What's the
prevent a
question? Oh my
second
God.
Inquisition or a
Forgot what the
Soviet-style
question was.
dictatorship where people have to proclaim their allegiance to the state and faith?
I mean, it's kind of a hard question for me to answer because I'm not advocating for Christian nationalism, but I would say obviously we should be allowed to carry on as we are now, where everybody's allowed to choose what God they want to worship, choose the lifestyle they want to live, as long as they're not encroaching on the freedoms of other people. I think you should continue to have the right to do that. So it's my argument in the negative. Also, I do think it's kind of funny that Milo pointed out that everybody in here is addicted to consumerist packaging, when I'm pretty sure that bag is worth like 10 times more than my entire outfit.
It is. It is.
All right, now we will do the last question for you, Destiny, and then we'll go to the Q&A/crossfire. Some would argue that most people are naturally drawn to some sort of faith or belief in a higher power. How would you prevent your society from inevitably becoming a religious society and thus being run by the exact same organizing faith or ideas that you want to stop?
I mean, I think the important thing is for people to have something bigger than themselves to live for. I don't think it has to be religion, but if it was religion, I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world. I think that the defining aspect of the United States is that a lot of people with contradictory ideas can exist within the same geographic borders, governed by the same legal system, voting on the same politicians, and somehow finding a way to make all of that work. I think we've done it for hundreds of years. I think we do it better than any other country on the planet. Right now, today, not before 1980, not in the 1200s, but today in 2023, I think we have an incredibly diverse country of people, all sorts of creeds, all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of different types of people that seem to be living together and making it work. I think we have problems right now, like I mentioned earlier, with the political division. And I think that that's a real problem that we need to combat, but I think we need to do it by having honest conversations about what we can do to move forward, not by talking to people that want to look back hundreds or thousands of years to what society used to look like before there was Gucci and hairdressers.
Yeah, I mean, that seems true to me. Again, I think the idea to press upon here is that a liberal government, a morally neutral state that exists to protect individual rights and their property, and individual private property, and to provide, well, I mean, it depends, but basically providing basic kind of necessities or safety nets for people such that they can contribute if you think that that's what they should do. A liberal society arguably offers a much better way of doing that. Destiny touched upon this idea of like people feel that they need to contribute to something larger than themselves. I think that is, I mean, what he's talking about is what we call meaning in life. Again, it sounds a lot like Nozick in terms of extending past one's limits and contributing to or getting in touch with something of in kind of intrinsic worth. The thing is, again, that we have different things that we would prefer to be doing in order to do that. And the beautiful thing about liberal democracy is that if someone chooses of their own volition to join a church or a mosque or whatever, that is good, because that means that that person has chosen a meaningful life, right? They've just, the conception of it is just different from someone else's. When you have a state-mandated religion that effectively imposes through coercive force the meaning or purpose of someone's life, that shoe is not going to fit everyone's foot. Right? And it's hard to think, it's hard to imagine a world, particularly somewhere like America, such a diverse population, just that the one shoe would fit every single person. You're going to get some serious problems there. And it seems a solution for someone like Milo is to eject them at best and kill them at worst. And I presume if you have a society in which you have to kick people out or execute them, that is not a working society. That is like a threshold that someone needs to pass in order for a society to be considered working.
I could live without both if it meant that you would be left on a mountainside somewhere, your parents wondering which god they'd pissed off, which is
Oh, the other thing too, he talks about this idea that, I don't know if this is right in the last one, Destiny also talked about this idea of people segregating, like self-imposed segregation, in this, it's, I guess for an American audience, that's a very triggering word, the idea that people kind of silo themselves off into different kind of networks, such that they no longer communicated. So for example, social media, Twitter, before Elon Musk, a number of, the narrative we hear is that when it was a publicly traded company, it was banning conservative or more controversial thinkers, and that this was effectively an attack on their free speech. So the thought goes, it's clearly not, but that's another kettle of fish. And then what ended up happening is they moved to things like Rumble or Truth Social Media or whatever, and they effectively silo themselves off. So they end up in these little pockets of the bubbles, if you will, silos, which they're only kind of talking to people who agree with them. Now, it's not clear to me that that's right. It's not clear to me that that's bad, right? Because a part of what it is to be free in a liberal democracy is to choose who you associate with and who you choose not to associate with. That is part of what it is to build or shape one's life. There might be varying disagreements about the kind of justification of that or the kind of consequential upshots. But unfortunately, that's part of any damage, any bad consequences that are generated out of that might be just an unfortunate byproduct of what it means for people to freely associate and disassociate if they so choose to. And that arguably is a strength. You might consider that a strength of a liberal democracy. Yeah, so just because people aren't all sharing the same platform doesn't immediately strike me as a bad thing.
exactly what would have happened in a pre-Christian civilization to something like you.
Probably would have left the gays there before people like me.
Well, I don't think you can tell when it pops out whether it's going to like cock or not. Maybe if it's your kid, but I'm sure you'll ensure that's the case.
I mean, you'd know all about kids liking, huh? Isn't that?
Would I? Would I? Would I? Tell us more about that. Would I? Because that's a pretty big allegation. Would I?
Would you what?
Would I know about that?
Well, seems like it. Isn't that what you got canceled for?
No, I got cancelled for talking about the fact that I was a victim of clerical sexual abuse. I was...
So about like little boys liking, right?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, yeah, I
There
mean...
you go. You got there eventually. It's okay.
Okay.
I can tell you're coming down right now, but I'll walk you through the rest of my jokes if you need me to.
No, fair enough. Okay, you're bringing it. Fine. It's just a shame Father Michael's dead. He would have liked that. I think if...
I think I saw a clip recently where Destiny was somewhat in two minds about how he should have handled this. Part of him regrets not going in any further. I can see why after a comment like that from Milo, and this weird moral indignation he has about about being called out on it and about being kind of like attacked. But I think a mark of, I think it's a mark of maturity, but also just a surgical strike. So the problem with like doing these sorts of things kind of off the cuff is that obviously I say a lot of words and you might say just get to the fucking point. What's really kind of beautiful about that kind of response that he offers there is that it is just surgical. It just hits like bang right in there and cuts just all of the shit out and just makes the point immediately. And that is for someone who really appreciates clarity and conciseness and simplicity. That is a beautiful riposte and a beautiful moment. And you don't need to go just like an attack dog at someone if you can just like find the point and just press it. And that is what he did. And it's incredible because that's all he needs to say. And that is a testament to his wit.
I don't know that it makes me an expert on kids liking being raised by a priest, but...
it's kind of like, how would I compare it? I would compare it to someone, what's a good description? If someone just kind of like putting a gun behind them while doing something else and just taking a shot and hitting a bullseye, or lighting the match, throwing it behind them and then walking away from the explosion. The idea is you don't need to do, when you really like, you don't need to like total war something to win. There's something really beautiful about being able to just like press one domino or one card and just watch the whole thing fucking collapse. It's so good.
If you want some comedy lessons afterwards, I'm happy to give you 20 minutes. What was the question? Sorry, I was so bored.
The question was, some would argue that most people are naturally drawn to some sort of faith or belief in a higher power. How would you, Destiny, prevent your society from inevitably becoming a religious society and thus being run by the same organizing faith ideas?
I think it's a bit lazy to say, as people often do, that we now have a kind of alternate sort of progressive religion. I don't think that progressivism really functions like a religion. It's true that when you take God out of things, you don't just sort of, get rid of him. In the same way that when you get rid of a king, you don't really get rid of the king. You still are ruled by people that you have no power over. The difference is that in America, you don't know their names because they lurk behind that flag, rubbing their hands and making money off you and getting you addicted to things. You don't know their names, so you can't assassinate them. One reason monarchy is better.
Okay, we're going for the murder thing again. To be clear, bureaucracy obviously exists in all forms of society. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't exist in his. And this idea of talking about people becoming addicted to things. If you're talking about private businesses doing that, there's no reason to think that a private business couldn't figure out some way of doing that. Because if they do it in a liberal democracy where power is dispersed, it's going to be a lot easier doing it in a society in which power is concentrated.
I think... Sorry, I forgot one question. Oh, it was about how do you prevent it from sliding in? Yeah, I think it's lazy when people say, "Oh, we've replaced kind of one religion with a progressive religion." It's true that when God moves out, that other things move in. You don't just kind of get rid of it and now everyone's happy and now everyone can just be nice to each other. That yearning that you've acknowledged that we all have has got to be satisfied by something. So if you take the Christian God out, something worse moves in, because there isn't anything better than that. There isn't anything better than that for organizing society. There isn't anything better than that for teaching people how to behave to one another. There isn't anything better than that objectively, practically, and empirically. So things do move in, but progressivism of the type that he likes doesn't function like a religion, because all religions have one thing in common that his political orthodoxy doesn't, and that's salvation and forgiveness. Because there is no forgiveness for people who are cancelled, whether or not they were responsible for what happened to them and were trying to make sense of an abuse experience, or whether they said something that they shouldn't have said. There's no way back, there's no forgiveness, there's no redemption. And that's the thing that all religions, except for this orthodoxy, seem to have in common. So I don't think it's... I think it's a bit lazy to say that one religion gets replaced by another, but it is definitely true that you cannot simply chop off the top of the pyramid and expect everything to be fine. Something worse will slither its way up there, and it has.
Okay. To be honest, I'm not really paying much attention to him anymore. Well, first, the metaphor of the pyramid being at the bottom is a bad one. You would want to flip it. You would want to say something about foundations being knocked out and a whole house collapsing. The idea for him is that God is the foundation of these sorts of society, whether they realize it or not. Removing him necessarily causes it to collapse. Obviously, if you have a pyramid, you take the top off, the pyramid still stands. It can function fine. Something might come up to the top of it, that's fine, because nothing rests upon the top, everything rests upon the foundation. So that's a really bad metaphor. I do not recall what he said, but I'm sure it was a total waste of everybody's time.
Thank you guys so much. Let's give everybody, both of them, a round of applause, please. Now we're going to move into the audience Q&A. So,
okay, so that brings us to the end of this particular romp through this debate. So, what are the major takeaways here? The major takeaways is that the Christian Nationalist, or at least Milo, oh, that's right, he said something along the lines of that it's just obviously the case, conceptually, empirically, blah, blah, blah. It's a great assertion, really could use an argument. Doesn't provide one, doesn't provide anything. We have no argument for that. What are the major takeaways here? The major takeaway, obviously, is Milo is completely washed up. Could that change in the future? I mean, it's logically possible, but in seeing his condition right now, it is certainly not practically. He is utterly irrelevant, and that's fine. Because it makes space for more interesting people to come in and see what their ideas are. And you know what? That's the beauty of a liberal democracy or a liberal, morally neutral state, is that it allows people to drop by the wayside and have more interesting ideas, hopefully more truthful ideas take their place to be tested. And if people take it up, that's fine. Yeah, so what are the major takeaways? The major takeaway is that the Christian Nationalist provides us no, at least Milo's conception of it, provides us no reason for thinking that a Christian morality provides the best society or the most workable society. Doesn't provide us any reason for thinking that one needs to also believe in God in order to make use of this morality. And third, even if that is the case, that in order for the Christian morality to operate, and it is the best, requires believing in God, does not follow that it's the best way to organize society, or that the state should be mandating that we live that way. It doesn't follow at all. He needs to show some sort of reason, just any reason would be great for thinking any of that. So it's a complete fucking wipe. It's a complete waste of everyone's time listening to him. I presume that there are people out there who attempt to do something like that, but he's not it. With regards to Destiny, I mean, Destiny, if I understand the topic correctly, all he had to do was argue the negative. And that doesn't mean he has to say anything about why we should be liberals. But the kind of beginning arguments that he offered were particularly weak. They don't provide us any moral reason or any for thinking that liberal democracy would be better. So here's what I mean by this is this, right? Even if Milo does not show all the things that he has to, it doesn't follow from that he's wrong, right? We just have to be agnostic about it. So we need some sort of reasons for supposing that a liberal democracy is better and produces a more workable society than the Christian Nationalist one. That's what you would need to show in order to defeat that position completely. Destiny attempted to do that at the start, obviously completely lost interest after that, which is very fair. But the arguments he presented at the beginning with regards to a kind of inevitability or a type of division within the other movement, or what was the other one I've written here? About meaning in life, I don't think that these were compelling the way he presented them. And indeed, it probably couldn't be. I don't think the technology one can be. I think that's a very good one at all, or the division one. Again, because we have historical like counter evidence to those claims. He would need to provide something that he would need. Well, first you would need to say what it is for a society to be workable, or good, or better, or whatever kind of value you want to put on it. And then you would need to show that a liberal democracy either is necessary for producing those sorts of outcomes, or at least you would need to show that it is better at producing those sorts of outcomes than its competition, in this case, Christian nationalism. Yeah, I think that's all. I think, what kind of moral arguments could you offer? I think if you read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, particularly on individuality, which is a core tenet of liberal democracy, that would provide a very strong kind of moral argument, which I think is pretty in alignment with Destiny's kind of omni-liberalism, which is just classical liberalism in a different name. Or I think the last chapter of Robert Nozick talking about utopia and what's inspiring about a minarchist state. Yeah, so that's it for today. Now I've got to do actual work. I think tomorrow I'm going to look at Richard Spencer and Destiny. I think that's a much more interesting conversation. I'd imagine. Spencer, for all of his faults, is at least more cogent. So until next time, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. If you liked this, you can like it. It doesn't matter. I don't care. I'm just going to keep doing this anyway. So you live your life however you want. And yeah, do whatever. Just do whatever.